I met Paul Dawalibi a couple of years ago when we met up to compare our notes and thoughts about the web video industry. And a couple of years ago, we connected on LinkedIn, and recently I saw some of his posts and podcasts appear on my LinkedIn feed where he was pontificating on the business of esports. So once I started to follow some of his observations, I thought it would be interesting to have him on the show to compare notes about where we each see the future of the industry. Paul, thanks for joining us today on Context is King.
Thanks for having me, Ash. I appreciate being here.
My pleasure. So we met, I've been running WatchMojo for a while. I know that you serve as an investor, an advisor. You've been a builder. You kind of wear many hats. And then, God bless LinkedIn, one day I see you riffing on esports. And I was like, esports seems to be getting bigger and bigger. I like to talk to people that know what they're doing. So first off, to put it into context, is your interest in esports as an observer, as an entrepreneur, as an investor, like what's your vantage point when you're commenting and analyzing the industry?
I mean, the not so good answer there is all of the above. So, my interest in esports goes back a very long time. I've been a hardcore gamer. You can't see it because my gaming computers are actually in front of me here, but you can see some of the setup in the back here. I've been a hardcore gamer my whole life. Love gaming, play every night, compete. And when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, I would tell my parents, look, I want to be a pro gamer. I'm thinking of quitting school and going to do this pro gaming thing. And they laughed at me, right? Like at that time, we're talking 20 plus years ago, that just wasn't an option. So when I got out of my last business, and I've been a company builder and an investor for the last part of a decade or more, when I got out of my last business, I said, well, what do I want to do? And the one sort of regret that I knew I'd be saddled with if I didn't do something about it is I want to be a pro gamer. I've always wanted to be a pro gamer, except I'm too old now, right? The average age of a pro gamer now is like 18 to 20. At 20, you're over the hill. So at 36, in my case, this was a pipe dream. And so instead I said, how can I apply my expertise, which is company building, which is investing? How can I apply that to esports and essentially own the industry? Because my view is esports is at the very beginning. And so I want to do all of the above. I want to build companies. I am building companies. And I want to invest, and I want to advise, and I want to participate in sort of all the ways where I can apply my skills.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think back in the day it was an option, but if you wanted to be unemployed, but the market's changed quite a bit. Okay, good stuff. Yeah. So, I run a company that, serves a lot of gamers. So where do you draw the line between just gaming and esports? Because it is still a world that is being developed and defined, so to speak.
I think anytime you have gamers competing, you could call it an esport. That's the distinction I make. It's, this is why I have some issues when people throw around numbers around the size of the esports industry versus gaming. The problem is it's not well defined. I think anytime you have competitive gaming in some sense, it's an esport. And I think as we go sort of over the next 10 years, even 5 years, esports, the word, will begin to consume sort of all of gaming. I think we'll just call it esports or gaming very interchangeably.
That's fair enough. So how big is the domain, this world, this market that we're talking about? You're seeing advertisers getting very excited. You're seeing celebrities piling on. In your worldview, as an opportunistic, as an investor, as an analyst, how big is this market? And don't just throw out numbers. Put it in context of something else. Like compare it to whether it's traditional sports or Hollywood or whatever else, or gaming. How big is this market, in fact?
I mean, there are numbers that everyone throws out, right? So about 2.3 billion gamers around the world today. So people who consider themselves gamers. Today, the gaming industry, so broadly, generates more revenue than the entire TV industry. So gaming as a in its entirety, not just esports, everything gaming today is generating more revenue than TV. When you look at traditional sports, other than the Super Bowl, a big tournament, a big esports tournament like the International, which is a Dota 2 tournament, Dota 2 is a game, will draw a larger audience than literally every traditional sports championship other than the Super Bowl. So it's not that gaming is sort of 10 years away from being something significant. It's massive today. It's only the mainstream that's just starting to catch on to it. That's really the tipping point that's happening. But the size has been there for a while. I think what's exciting is the sky's the limit here, right? Like we're already bigger than most traditional sports. We're already bigger than most traditional mediums. The future here, my simple view and my thesis and why 100% of my focus today is on esports is the future of all entertainment. It's not.
Okay, break that down. How? Just because of others being tangentially involved, like a celebrity still has music and they're going to be a sponsor, or like, Ford is going to sponsor it, or because esports will be at the core of what Drake does and at the core of what Toyota does? I just want to get a sense of how you view that.
Are you a Star Trek fan, Ash?
I know Star Trek. I'm probably a fan of bigger things, but yeah.
Okay, so if I can convince you that there's a future where a virtual world is completely indistinguishable from the real world, right? I'm assuming I can convince you that at some point technology advances to that point where I can create a virtual world and you can't tell the difference. The sights, the smells, the sounds, touch, mobility, everything recreates the real world perfectly. If I can convince you that that future exists, okay, then my view is all other entertainment becomes a subset of gaming. In other words, why would you go play football in the real world if I can go play football in a virtual world, not get hurt, compete against whoever I want? Like, I'd love to be able to play basketball, but I'm not tall enough. So in a virtual world, though, that's not an issue.
But first of all, when you run WatchMojo, you have to define and quantify what constitutes being a fan versus not, right? That's why I was answering the Star Trek question a bit like that. So look,
no, but the Star Trek holodeck is what I usually refer to, right? If that
but there's a fundamental difference there. If I love playing sports, I like the competition, but I like more like sweating, taking on others in a real world, the smell of grass, or if it's fake turf, sliding on that grass and not kind of burning myself. Like there's an aspect that in that virtual setting, you're not really getting, right? It's like saying, well, like watching, you know what I mean? Like it's not as static as just watching sports. But so in your worldview, esports gives you the exact same rush as playing the sport, really.
What I'm saying is there is a future where it will be indistinguishable, right?
But if I'm having sex with a robot versus sex with a woman, do we agree that those are still different things? Or is in your world those are the same things?
At some point in the future, I think technology will be able to recreate all of the sights, smells, sounds, anything that you experienced, because they're all just electrical impulses processed by our brain.
I don't want to live in that future, by the way, but go on. Okay.
But if that future exists, and I believe it will, right? Why would you go to a concert with 10,000 people when I can go to a concert with 10 million people? And we're already seeing the start of that. So my view is traditional sports, music, movies, all of those forms of entertainment will still exist, but they will be a subset of gaming. They will take place in virtual and interactive worlds that are fundamentally games at their core.
Yeah, again, I mean, I will preface this by saying I'm 41, so I definitely get that there's a lot of things happening that I don't get, and I'm starting to realize that I'm older now, and so this may be one of them. But for me, I will never compare watching a musical artist with 50 people in a bar or club or venue with 5,000, 50,000, and 1 million. Now, I will say that all of those are different feelings and experiences, and they each have their appeal, but I'm not sure if I would equate them just yet. That's where I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect, but that's just for me, right?
But the beauty of that interactive world that I've painted, that Star Trek holodeck future, is one night you could go to a bar with 5 people and listen to someone playing jazz, and tomorrow you could be watching Marshmello play for 10 million people.
But the fact that you're wearing your pajamas and eating a bowl of cereal is just a detail in the background.
But that's the best part, right? And you could be living in middle of nowhere, Kentucky.
Yeah, I'm not knocking Kentucky. I'm knocking the sitting in your PJs and eating a bowl of cereal. Okay, so I get that, and I do see that whether I like it or not, there is that element, because the first time you would tell a sales guy, hey, why get on a plane and go meet somebody to pitch your business to them? You could just do what we're doing now. It would have seemed a bit crazy, right? But now it's like, hey, we're talking, and I think at least I see body language, I see a little bit, but it's still not the same thing as if we were sitting in the same room. So I'm a bit wary of those that automatically jump to the conclusion that it's the same experience. I'm saying it's a very different experience, but I realize why esports and what esports ultimately enables and involves opens up the opportunities dramatically. I do get that. Okay.
Yeah, and this is why when people talk about billions, I kind of laugh, because I think they're way underestimating what gaming broadly is going to be as an industry. We're talking trillions. Right?
Yeah, but the reason for that is the same reason why it's almost ridiculous now to talk about technology or the internet, that everything is tech-based. You know what I mean? Like the post office is tech-based. It's impressive, right? I mean, there's a dude who shows up, sure, but he's got technology hooked up to him that tells. So I think that the genie's out of the bottle. Everything is technology now. Everything is the internet. So in that context, I kind of understand the point you're making, that everything will have some component of game and competition or community into it. If you look at teaching, everything is going to be a game at some point. You have an entire generation that has been brought up playing games. So why wouldn't your school be a game? It's like if you want to teach somebody about history, it's a game instead of, so it's a video game. And then, okay, so I get that. Okay.
But Ash, you bring up a good point, which is it's going to take time, right? It's going to take 20 years for that shift to happen at least, and for technology to get there and all those kinds of things. But in that time, there's also a huge generation attention shift that's happening, right? If you ask any 10-year-old today if they'd rather go play football or go play Fortnite, I guarantee the majority are going to choose Fortnite.
Okay, I don't want to go on a tangent and play into stereotypes, but isn't that tied to at least partly why you have things like child obesity? And I know our fans are not going to like this. I don't actually believe that video games leads to violence. I mean, if I said that, I'd have the Mojoholics show up with pitchforks and ask me to resign. But what do you say to those who then say, well, that's why you got a bunch of fat kids who pick up a gun and go shoot things up and can't, I'm not going to blame video games for this, but this is probably the reason why so many younger people are just bad at communicating, because they communicate like this and they don't really, speak to people. Do you see that as related at all, or do you think that's just like a cheap way to, make an excuse for things that you may not like in society? Are you scapegoating?
I think it's an easy scapegoat. Look, of course, there are always outlier cases where someone was inspired, and obviously no one condones that, and the game companies don't condone that or anything like that. But the reality is people have been blaming new media for these same things for decades now, right? It was TV was making people fat and lazy. Then it was
Ozzy Osbourne,
then it was hip hop music making people violent, and then it was there's always something to blame in entertainment or media. And the reality is there's been no scientific evidence linking any of them.
No, I agree. I mean, look, I don't want to criticize the Catholic Church, which does enough to, bash itself these days. But growing up, the Catholic Church was always harping on Judas Priest and Ozzy Osbourne. If you actually look factually at the damage done by heavy metal music compared to the damage done to an entire generation of children, and
I think it's unfortunate with gaming, because my personal experience has been nothing but a positive one. I've made a lot of friends gaming. I have a lot of relationships that are in sort of games. And I think it has a way to bring people together,
all right,
almost unlike any other.
You can put down the violin music. We get it. Gaming is fine. Okay, let's put the mushy stuff aside. You write about the business of esports.
Yep.
Context is king. It's about work to live, work, life, play. But it's ultimately, it's business through the lens of entrepreneurship. So you caught my attention. I mean, we knew each other before, but your website and podcast caught my attention because you were basically, for lack of a better word, shitting on owning an esports team.
Yeah.
So I want you to talk about that in the context of, in esports, we get it, it's bigger than anybody might think it is. Where's the stake? Where's the sizzle? What are the opportunities? What are the flops? How can you make money and succeed in esports? And what are the kind of, things you want to avoid?
So, that's a loaded question because there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing that I think one of the reasons I was attracted to the industry is I understand the nuance of games and gaming and esports. And I think any investor wanting to play in the space, if you don't understand that piece, you're going to lose your money, right? Like, it's not just good enough to understand tech or the business side. Gaming is an animal unto itself. You have to understand the nuance of the space. Now, I'm very bearish on esports teams because the reality is owning an esports team is not like owning a football team, right?
Why? Break that down. What is the main difference?
Football has not changed in 100+ years, right? It's the same game it's always been, and people have always played it the same way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I can pick up a football and start my own tournament here, and no one's going to stop me, right? In esports, those two factors are very different. So first, a game that is being played actively today, 5 years from now, could be completely obsolete. No one could play it, right? So if I'm investing in an Overwatch team, but no one plays Overwatch 5 years from now, what does that happen to the value of my team? What does that do to the value of my team? And I think that's a huge risk. The second piece is the publishers have tremendous control in esports. They're gatekeepers. They make all the rules. They set all the terms. So if you want to be a team owner in Overwatch, Blizzard decides what cut you get. They decide whether you own your brand or not. They decide who they can license to and who they can't. They decide what advertisers you can have or can't have, right? They have literally complete control over everything you do. And that to me is a huge risk. So my conclusion has always been the only value of owning an esports team is really in the franchise spots that you own. And even then, the value depends on the notion that someone at some point in the future is going to pay you more than what you paid for it, right? That Overwatch will last long enough. It's speculation, and with a ton of risk attached to it. And the reality is, all these esports teams are bleeding money. They're losing money like crazy. They're burning through investor cash like crazy. The fundamentals of the business they're just bad.
Okay, so going down that tangent, is there room for something like the Olympic sports of esports, the Olympics of esports, where you want to flip the model and get a little bit of leverage on, say, Overwatch and League of Legends, where you go, hey, we're going to be playing lots of games. Hopefully we'll get one of the big ones. There may be some up-and-coming games and, whatever. You find a way to kind of just flip the model or not really.
I mean, the problem is to do that, you would still need the buy-in of the publishers. And to get that buy-in, you're essentially handing the power back to them, right? They're not going to buy in for nothing. They're going to want some piece of the action, and they're going to set the terms for the most part, especially if it's a popular game like League of Legends or Overwatch or Counter-Strike or any of these things. Now, if the Olympics themselves decided to get into esports, that's a different story, right? That's a big enough brand that it may turn the tables on the publishers. The publishers may, concede just because they want to be a part of something so historic. But the reality is the Olympics have not been all that excited about esports and have not expressed a ton of excitement about getting into esports.
Why?
Somewhat of an irony and hypocrisy, I would say. They think it's too violent. So it's fine, biathlon's fine where you're skiing and shooting a gun, or skeet shooting where you're literally shooting a gun. But shooting a fake gun in an esport, they think is too violent.
Is it that, or is that the excuse and they're afraid that it might become more, popular than some of these, than curling, and then they might be giving so much more credibility faster to something that will, like you said, be bigger than sports anyway?
It's a good theory, Ash. My view is they just don't understand it, right? It's kind of like the NCAA. They don't understand it. They don't know how to react to it. In some ways, it's a real threat to their business, right? If my future is true, in 20 years, no one's going to care to watch the Olympics, not unless they're being played in virtual worlds. And so it's a threat. And I think the combination of that and not understanding esports or gaming at all makes it so that they make these kinds of less than ideal decisions.
So what are some of the good ways to capitalize and pursue esports if you want to create value, make money?
I mean, my view is there's a huge opportunity in all of the infrastructure, in everything other than the teams, pretty much, teams or games, where you're investing in technologies, in analytics, in tools, in ways to engage fans and players. And there's a lot of ad tech that still needs to be sorted out for esports. So there's a lot of like areas, buckets of opportunity that are not games or teams, where I think there's going to be a lot of money made as the industry matures.
So when you see these celebrities backing, is this a fad? Or again, I know I'm back to the fad or not, but what I mean is more, you're really seeing a lot of celebrities go deeper and deeper. My point is, are you going to see these worlds just blur, where pretty much every celebrity is involved one way or another because everything that they do in one way or another is meshed into esports? Or do you think that celebrities will move on to the next fad and this will just be normal, but there's no need for Drake to show up and be like, I'm throwing money to this esports club?
Look, I consider most of these investments dumb money, right? These are not sophisticated investors. They're maybe very good business people, but they're not sophisticated investors. But they are gamers, right? So I think they're just investing in something that they understand, right? Drake plays Fortnite, he plays games, and so it's familiar to him. You combine that with the crazy hype around esports, and it's no surprise that they're throwing money at this. I do think it's a fad. I do think enough of them will get burned, especially on some of the team investments, that they'll say, look, let me stick to what I know. This is not worth my time. So we're going to see a lot of it, though. I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. I think the next 2 or 3 years are sort of maximum hype for esports and the kinds of investors and the quantities of money that will flow into the industry.
Are you questioning the value of the education at Degrassi High? No, I'm kidding. I'm joking. Okay, so every time there's like hype in a marketplace, things grow really steep, fast, then there's a bit of a correction. And then if the market is valid, legitimately promising, then it continues to grow. And oftentimes in the future, it goes to a higher peak. Where are we in that cycle? Are we still growing esports? Has there been a crash? But is this now the sustained long-term one, or is there going to be a crash, and then there's going to be a resumption? Where are we at in the grander scheme of things?
Look, anytime you see esports teams that are burning through cash, that have no plan to be profitable whatsoever, that have terrible management, raising tens of millions of dollars, basically sight unseen, no diligence, like anytime you see that kind of thing, we're definitely on that upwards curve, that upwards trajectory. So we haven't reached peak hype yet. And when we do get there, though, there will be a correction, right? Some of these, especially the teams, are going to go out of business. There will be a correction in the market. Investors will lose money. But I don't think that has any impact on the long-term viability of the industry. This will still be a massive industry. It will still be $1 trillion industry. But I think what it will do is shake out most of the dumb money.
So who's going to be the Google? Who's going to be the Apple? Who are going to be the titans of this industry?
I don't think that's been figured out yet. So, there are some big players already, again, more on the game developer side. So you have the game developer side is, I would say, relatively well sorted out. You have Activision Blizzard, you have EA, you have Take-Two Interactive. These are kinds of the bigger players, public companies. And I think they will remain big players for a long time. On the hardware side, that's been pretty well sorted out. So obviously there's a hardware component to the gaming industry. You have NVIDIA, you have AMD, you have Intel. All those guys obviously are going to be around for a while. But I think there are companies that will pop up that, again, are in that layer underneath the teams, that tech layer that will serve the industry, selling some kind of tech or services that will be large companies in and of themselves.
Yeah, but I guess I was looking more as a parallel to say if like Microsoft was like its success was a function of, say, the computer, And then you had the internet, and sure, today Microsoft benefits from the cloud and the internet. Google, you needed Google to come along and like profit from the internet, and then it became bigger. And then if mobile was the next frontier, again, Google profits from Android, but you had Apple come, for example, right? So I was asking more, obviously, like the players that traditionally were in gaming that figured it out and got into e-gaming, I get that. But are there any pure play esports native companies that people should be paying attention to? Or I guess to your point, is esports really just ultimately, gaming 2.0? And no, it's normal that the same players, or not players, the same companies that were successful in gaming are just going to transition over and become leaders of esports.
Yeah, I don't think there are any players today that are esports specific, not general gaming, that are very large companies that I would say this is one to watch. Most of those companies are still relatively small, still mostly startup stage. But that's why I think there's a lot of opportunity, right? Because that hasn't been figured out yet. The winners haven't been chosen yet. And then, so, there will be a data and analytics company that dominates the esports space, right? The data and analytics is such a big part of this space. It's a digital first world, right? Unlike traditional sports. There will be a very big player in this space, but that hasn't been figured out yet, just as an example.
Got it. And then what about the North America versus world? Is this ultimately a global phenomenon where it'll be evenly spread out in terms of potential? Or when you look at, for example, Tencent has been making a lot of bets over in China. I'm sure there are like European leaders. Like, where do you see the leadership in terms of geography coming from? Is it basically where the gamers are, or is it where the companies that are going to be the most aggressive? What's going to fuel the growth?
Obviously where the gamers are, right? And in that sense, North America has the disadvantage of just smaller population. There will be an order of magnitude more gamers in geographies outside of North America. But it doesn't mean that it won't be a very valuable industry inside of North America, because gamers here tend to be more affluent than the average, et cetera, right? The demographics work in favor of the industry. I think the benefit of esports as a form of entertainment, again, compared to just about everything else, is it's global by nature, right? I can play with someone sitting in New York today, and I can play with someone in Australia tomorrow, and there's literally nothing that stops me. The fact that it skews younger, it's digital first, and it's global, those are the three factors that make esports the threat to all other entertainment, really.
Last question. What's the biggest risk or unknown or threat facing this industry as a whole?
There will be growing pains. I wouldn't call that a threat to the industry, but there will be growing pains. The reality of gaming and esports is the industry has succeeded, I would argue, in spite of the people there. That most of the industry grew up out of gamers. And it's a tremendous accomplishment on most of them that they built this industry with very little business building expertise or business expertise in general, with very little outside investors, right? A lot of the industry popped up sort of out of the cottage industry and pastime of gaming. The reality is, though, that as that transitions to a more sophisticated, mature market with business people and investors and their own expectations, there will be growing pains. There will be huge failures, very public failures. There will be missteps. You're going to see sort of the full gamut of blow-ups as the industry matures. I don't think there's really any long-term risk, though, to its success. To me, the outcome is almost inevitable.
Fascinating. All right, Paul Dawalibi, thank you very much for joining us. The Business of Esports, check out your websites. Really insightful. Enjoy your rants. Hope to have you on the show again in the future.
Thank you so much, Ash. Pleasure being here.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Context is King with our guest, Paul Dawalibi. Join us next time for another guest to talk about another topic.